The desert wind carried nothing but dust and memories that Jacob Mackenzie wished he could forget. 15 years had passed since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their unborn child beneath the cottonwood tree behind their ranch house. Yet the ache in his chest felt as fresh as morning frost on sagebrush. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his aging mare, Dusty, as they made their way across the unforgiving terrain of northern Mexico. The sun beat down mercilessly, its rays creating waves of heat that danced across the horizon like ghosts of better times. Jacob's face, carved by years of solitude and grief, showed every one of his 47 years. Deep lines etched around his gray eyes told stories of sleepless nights and endless days of wondering what might have been. The small border town of Agua Prieta lay behind him now, another place where he'd tried and failed to find peace. Worked odd jobs there for 3 months, fixing wagons, breaking horses, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But the nightmares always found him, Sarah's voice calling his name, the sound of children's laughter that would never echoed through his empty house. Should have stayed in Texas, he muttered to Dusty, his voice hoarse from disuse. The horse's ears twitched at the familiar sound, the only conversation she'd heard in weeks.
Out.
Ain't nothing for us out here but more of the same. Jacob had been drifting for years now, moving from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form attachments or face questions about his past. The weight of his Colt .45 at his hip had kept him alive through confrontations with bandits and rustlers. But it couldn't protect him from the ghosts that rode alongside him every mile of the way as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Jacob spotted something that made him pull up short. Smoke, thin and black, rising from what looked like a small canyon about 2 miles ahead. His first instinct was to turn away. Other people's troubles weren't his concern anymore. But something made him hesitate. The smoke was wrong. Not the steady stream of a campfire or the thick billows of a house burning. This was sporadic, desperate, like someone trying to signal for help. Against his better judgment, Jacob urged Dusty forward. As they approached the canyon's edge, the sounds reached him first. Children crying. The sharp crack of gunfire in the distance. Voices shouting in Spanish, harsh and threatening. Jacob dismounted and crept to the rim of the canyon, his heart pounding with an energy he hadn't felt in years. Below, huddled behind a cluster of boulders, were 7 children. They looked to be Yaqui, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 14 years old. Their clothes were torn and dirty, faces streaked with tears and dust. The oldest, a girl with fierce, dark eyes, held a smoking piece of green wood, their makeshift signal fire. Beyond them, Jacob could see riders approaching from the east. 6 men on horseback, wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as bounty hunters or worse. Their leader, a man with a silver tooth that glinted in the sunlight, raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that sent the children scrambling deeper behind the rocks. "Come on out, little rabbits," the man called in accented English. "We know. You're there. Make this easy on yourselves." Jacob's hand instinctively moved to his gun. This wasn't his fight. These weren't his children. He should mount up and ride away. Let someone else play hero. But as he watched the smallest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, peek out from behind his sister with eyes full of terror, something shifted inside Jacob's chest. For the first time in 15 years, Jacob Mackenzie felt something other than emptiness. He felt rage. The canyon walls amplified every sound, the children's frightened whispers, the creak of leather saddles, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Jacob studied the scene below with the calculated eye of a man who'd survived. More gunfights than he cared to remember. 6 men against 1 wasn't good odds, but the terrain favored him. The bounty hunters were spread out across the canyon floor, focused entirely on the children's hiding spot. They hadn't noticed Jacob positioned above them on the rim. Last chance, muchachos, Silvertooth called out, spurring his horse closer. To the rocks. Boss wants you alive, but he didn't say nothing about unmarked. The oldest girl, she couldn't have been more than 14, stood up slowly, her chin raised in defiance. We have done nothing wrong, she said in clear English, though her accent was thick. We are just children. When I children with a price on their heads. Another rider laughed, a thin man with cruel eyes. Your papa should have thought about that before. He started making trouble for decent folks. Jacob's jaw tightened. Whatever these children had done, or whatever their father had been involved in, they didn't deserve this. He'd seen enough innocents suffer in his lifetime, moving with the quiet efficiency that had kept him alive all these years. Jacob worked his way down a narrow path along the canyon wall. Bounty hunters were so focused on their prey that they never saw death approaching from above. Jacob's first shot took Silvertooth clean out of his saddle. The man's rifle clattered against the rocks as his body hit the ground. The remaining 5 men spun in confusion, trying to locate the source of the gunfire. Up there. One of them shouted, pointing toward Jacob's position, but Jacob was already moving, using the canyon's natural cover to his advantage. His second shot caught the thin man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his horse rearing in panic. The children had pressed themselves flat against the ground, the older girl shielding the youngest with her own body. Jacob could see them clearly now, 4 boys and 3 girls, all with the distinctive features of the Yaqui people. Their clothes were travel-worn but well-made, suggesting they came from a family of some means. Kill him. One of the remaining bounty hunters screamed, firing wildly in Jacob's direction. The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jacob moved through the canyon like a ghost, using every rock and crevice for cover. Years of solitude hadn't dulled his skills of anything. They'd sharpened them. Each shot was precise, purposeful. When the dust settled, 4 of the bounty hunters lay dead. The wounded man and 1 other had managed to escape, riding hard toward the east and leaving their fallen companions behind. Jacob emerged from cover slowly, his gun still drawn, but pointed toward the ground. The children remained huddled behind their rocks, watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. It's all right, Jacob said softly, holstering his weapon. They're gone. The oldest girl stood first, her protective stance never wavering. Who are you? She asked, her English heavily, accented but clear. Name's Jacob, he replied, removing his hat. Jacob Mackenzie. You hurt? She shook her head, then looked back at the other children. Speaking rapidly in what Jacob assumed was Yaqui, she seemed to be reassuring them. One by one, they emerged from hiding. The youngest boy, the one who'd caught Jacob's attention earlier, stepped forward on shaky legs. His face was dirt-streaked, his dark hair falling into eyes that were far too old for his 6-year-old features. Gracias, Señor, the boy whispered, then surprised Jacob by switching to English. Thank you. Jacob knelt down to the boy's level, something twisting in his chest at the sight of such courage in someone so small. What's your name, son? Miguel, the boy replied, then pointed to his siblings. That's Elena, Carlos, Rosa, Diego, Ana, and Dee. Joaquin, 7 names. 7 faces looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope. 7 reasons why his solitary life had just become infinitely more complicated. What are you children doing out here alone? Jacob asked Elena. The clear leader of the group. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked far older than her 14 years. Our father. He tried to protect our village from men who wanted to take our land. They killed him. They killed our mother too. We ran. The simple words carried a weight of loss that Jacob recognized all too well. He saw his own pain reflected in their young faces, and something inside him that had been frozen for 15 years began to thaw. How long you been running? 5 days, Carlos, who looked about 12, answered. No food since yesterday. Jacob looked at the 7 faces surrounding him, saw the hunger and exhaustion they were trying so hard to hide, made a decision that would change everything. Well, he said, standing and adjusting his hat, reckon we better find you something to eat. The abandoned mining camp Jacob remembered from his earlier travels turned out to be exactly what they needed: shelter. A well with clean water and Enough distance from the main trails to buy them time to figure out their next move. As twilight painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Jacob watched the children work together to set up their temporary home with an efficiency that spoke of recent hard-won experience. Alina directed the younger ones in gathering firewood, while Carlos and Diego, the two middle boys, helped Jacob tend to Dusty and scout the perimeter. "You don't have to help us," Alina said, as Jacob returned from hunting with 2 rabbits for their dinner. Her English had improved noticeably just in the few hours they'd been together, as if talking to him was helping her remember lessons from better times. "We can take care of ourselves." Jacob looked at her. Ellie looked. She was trying so hard to be strong, to be the adult these children needed. But underneath that fierce determination, he could see the scared 14-year-old girl she really was. "I'm sure you can," he said gently, settling down to clean the rabbits. "But you don't have to anymore. Not alone, anyway." As he worked, the children gradually gathered around the fire. Miguel, the youngest, had barely left Jacob's side since the gunfight, following him like a shadow. No. He sat close enough to touch Jacob's elbow, his small hand occasionally, reaching out to brush against the cowboy's sleeve as if reassuring himself that this protector was real. "Tell us about yourself, Sinar, Jacob," Anna asked. She was about 8, with the same fierce eyes as Alina, but a gentler demeanor. "Do you have children?" The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe. 15. Years of practiced responses died in his throat as he looked at these 7 faces, illuminated by firelight, all waiting for his answer. "I had a family once," he managed finally. "Lost them a long time ago." "Like us," Miguel said softly, leaning against Jacob's arm. "We lost our family too." The simple acceptance in the boy's voice nearly undid Jacob completely. Here was this child who'd lost everything, offering comfort to a broken man he'd known for less than a day. "Yeah," Jacob whispered, his voice rough. "Cute." As they shared the simple meal of roasted rabbit and the last of the children's supplies, Jacob learned their story. Their father, he discovered, had been a respected leader in their village near the Yaqui River in Sonora. When American mining interests had tried to force the villagers off their ancestral lands, he'd organized resistance. The response had been swift and brutal. "They came at night," Alina said, staring into the fire, "burned everything, killed anyone who fought back. Mama hid us in the root cellar when we came out." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "The men today," Jacob said carefully, "they were looking for you specifically." Carlos nodded grimly. "They have papers. Say we're worth money to the men who want to finish what they started. Make sure no one else gets ideas about standing up to them." Jacob's blood ran cold. These children weren't just orphans, they were targets. As long as they lived, they represented a threat to whatever operation had destroyed their village. "Your plan?" he asked Alina. "We have an aunt," she said, "in El Paso. If we can get there, she'll take us in, keep us safe." El Paso was at least a week's hard travel through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest. For 7 children, on foot it might as well have been on the moon. "That's a long way," Jacob said carefully. "We know," Alina replied, lifting her chin in that gesture of defiance he was beginning to recognize. "But we'll make it. We'll have to." As the fire burned lower and the younger children began to yawn, Jacob found himself studying each face. Diego, 10 years old, who watched the perimeter with the alertness of a seasoned scout. Rosa, 12, who had gently tended to small cuts and bruises on her siblings without complaint. Joaquin, 8, who had made the others laugh despite their circumstances by doing impressions of various animals. These weren't just children, they were survivors. They'd already shown more courage and determination than most adults Jacob had known. But courage alone wouldn't be enough to get them safely to El Paso. "Senor Jacob," Miguel said sleepily, curled up against Jacob's side like a small, trusting animal. "Will you stay with us tonight?" Jacob looked down at the boy's upturned face, saw the hope and fear warring in those dark eyes, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. For 15 years, he'd been running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of loss. But here was loss that had already happened. Children who needed protection, not someday, but right now. "Yeah, son," he said softly, adjusting his position so Miguel could rest more comfortably. I'll stay. As the children settled in for sleep around the dying fire, Alina approached Jacob one more time. The men who came today, she said quietly. They'll be back with more men. Jacob nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. The two who'd escaped would report back, and next time their pursuers would come prepared for armed resistance. Probably. Tomorrow, he agreed. You could leave, Alina said, her voice carefully neutral. In the morning, before they come. No one would blame you. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then at the sleeping forms of her siblings scattered around the fire. Miguel had curled up with his head on Jacob's leg, one small hand still clutching the cowboy's sleeve. I suppose I could, Jacob said finally. But you won't? The hope in Elena's voice was barely audible. Jacob Mackenzie, who had spent 15 years convinced he had nothing left to live for, looked at 7 orphan children who had chosen to trust him with their lives and realized he'd found his answer. No, he said quietly. I won't. Dawn came too soon, and with it the sound Jacob had been dreading, hoofbeats approaching from the east. He'd been awake since before first light, watching the horizon and trying to prepare for what he knew was coming. The children woke quickly and quietly, years of running having taught them to respond instantly to danger. Alina immediately began organizing the younger ones while Jacob counted the riders approaching their position. 12 men this time. The mining company wasn't taking any chances. There's a narrow trail behind the camp, Jacob told Alina, checking. His weapons leads up into the rocks. Take them that way and keep going until you reach the ridge. What about you? She asked, though they both knew the answer. Someone's got to slow them down. Jacob looked at each of the children one last time, memorizing their faces. Lena, you get them to El Paso, you hear me? Whatever happens, you get them safe. Miguel suddenly broke away from his siblings and wrapped his small arms around Jacob's waist. Don't leave us, Papa Jacob, he whispered, the words hitting Jacob like bullets to the chest. Papa Jacob, when had that happened? When had this broken man become a father to these brave children? I'm not leaving, Jacob said firmly, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. I'm just making sure you all get where you need to go. That's what fathers do. The sound of approaching riders grew louder. Jacob could make out individual voices now, men organizing for an assault on the camp. Go, he told Alina. Now. But before the children could move, a new sound cut through the morning air, more hoofbeats. But from the west this time. Jacob spun around to see another group of riders approaching, and his heart sank. They were surrounded. Then Miguel pointed excitedly. Tio Roberto, he shouted. Jacob looked more carefully at the western riders and saw they were different from the bounty hunters. These men wore the clothes of vaqueros and moved with the disciplined formation of people who knew how to work together. At their head rode a man who bore a strong resemblance to Alina. Uncle Roberto. Alina breathed, tears streaming down her face. The children's uncle and his men reached the camp just as the bounty hunters crested the eastern ridge. What followed was the kind of gunfight that would be talked about in cantinas. For years to come, Roberto and his vaqueros were clearly experienced fighters, but they were outnumbered. Jacob found himself fighting alongside men he'd never met to protect children who had somehow become his own. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the shooting stopped, 7 of the bounty hunters lay dead. The rest had retreated, but everyone knew they'd be back with even more men. Jacob Mackenzie, Roberto said, extending a weathered hand as they surveyed the aftermath. Alina told me about you in her letter. Her letter. Alina smiled for the first time since Jacob had met her. I sent word to Uncle Roberto from Agua Prieta before we ran. Told him we were coming. Told him about the man who saved us. We've been looking for you for 3 days, Roberto continued. When we found those 2 men yesterday bragging in a cantina about the gringo who'd interfered with their job, we knew we were close. Jacob looked at the children who were now surrounding their uncle with joyful tears and rapid conversations. In Yaqui, they were safe. They had family. They no longer needed a broken-down cowboy with more ghosts than sense. Reckon I'll be moving on then, Jacob said, turning toward where Dusty was tethered. Wait, Miguel called out, breaking away from the family reunion to run to Jacob's side. Where are you going? Well, son, you've got your uncle now, your family. You don't need. You are our family, Miguel interrupted, with the absolute certainty that only a child could possess. Your Papa Jacob. Jacob felt his throat constrict as he looked at the boy's upturned face. Around them, the other children had grown quiet, watching this exchange with intense focus. Miguel's right, Elena said, stepping forward. Uncle Roberto, this is the man I told you about. It's the one who gave us back our hope. Roberto studied Jacob with the measuring gaze of a man who'd learned to read character quickly and accurately. My letter mentioned a ranch in New Mexico, he said finally. Good land, water rights. I could use a partner, someone I trust to help me give these children the life their parents would have wanted. Jacob stared at him. You're offering me a home, Rosa said quietly. To Papa Jacob. He's offering you a home. Jacob Mackenzie looked at 7 faces that had become precious to him. At a man offering partnership instead of charity, at a future he'd never dared to imagine. For 15 years, he'd been running from the possibility of love because love meant the possibility of loss. But standing there in that abandoned mining camp, surrounded by children who called him father and a man willing to call him brother, Jacob realized something Sarah would have told him years ago if he'd been wise enough to listen. The risk of loss didn't diminish the value of love, made love more precious. Well, Jacob said slowly, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. I suppose Dusty could use a proper stable for a while. Miguel's whoop of joy echoed off the canyon walls, joined quickly by the voices of his siblings. Alina smiled that fierce smile, Roberto nodded with approval, and Jacob Mackenzie widowed Cowboy. Wandering soul, reluctant father finally found his way home. 6 months later, on a ranch outside Santa Fe, Jacob would stand in the doorway of a house filled with the sounds of children's laughter and realize that Sarah had been wrong about one thing. He hadn't lost everything when she died. He'd lost the family he'd had, but he'd gained the family he was meant to find. And every evening, as 7 children gathered around the dinner table he'd built with his own hands, calling him Papa Jacob, with voices full of love and trust, he knew that some stories don't end with loss. Sometimes they begin with it.